I want to put a great example of what the game is for the fans and the young people that come and watch. Like, I think that's really important, and I take that.
Steph Curry just exposed Brittney Griner and did not hold back a single word. And the WNBA has erupted in a way that combines the commercial weight of the most celebrated active shooter in the history of professional basketball, the institutional significance of one of the NBA's most respected voices choosing this specific moment to enter the most contentious governance accountability conversation in women's sports, and the specific evidentiary and institutional context that the entire arc of the Cunningham and Griner story has built throughout the most dramatic season in Wnba history to produce the single most institutionally consequential outside intervention in the Clark era's governance accountability effort that the basketball world has yet witnessed. Steph Curry did not hold back. He said what he said with the specific clarity and the specific directness that everyone who has been following this story and waiting for a voice of his institutional standing to enter it has been waiting to hear, and the Wnba's eruption in response is the appropriate institutional reaction to a governance accountability situation that has now attracted the involvement of a figure whose commercial standing, competitive philosophy, and specific relationship to the culture of basketball makes his public statement about Griner and the governance failures surrounding her conduct impossible for the Wnba's institutional management apparatus to manage through the standard mechanisms it has applied to every previous outside voice in the accountability conversation. Today, I am breaking down exactly what Curry said about Griner and why he chose this specific moment to say it, why the specific nature of what he exposed carries institutional weight that goes beyond every previous outside voice that has entered this conversation, what the Wnba's eruption tells you about how the governance apparatus is processing the specific commercial and institutional pressure that Curry's involvement creates, and what the combination of Curry's exposure and everything that has preceded it in the Clark era's governance accountability story means for where the institutional future of women's basketball is heading, as the accumulation of accountability interventions from the basketball world's most significant voices reaches a threshold that no governance apparatus could credibly continue to manage without producing the fundamental institutional changes the accountability effort has been demanding. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific element of what Curry said that the mainstream coverage is treating as the most dramatic moment of his statement, when it is actually the setup and the genuinely transformative institutional significance of what he exposed lies in what follows from the dramatic element rather than in the dramatic element itself. Steph Curry's position in the basketball world is one that carries a specific and unusual combination of commercial significance, competitive philosophy credibility, and cultural standing that no other active player in the broader basketball ecosystem brings to any public statement about women's basketball governance in exactly this combination. His commercial significance is second only to LeBron James among active NBA players, and in specific commercial domains, particularly those related to the culture of shooting excellence and the specific fan-base demographics that the three-point revolution in professional basketball has created. His commercial standing arguably exceeds LeBron's in specific and significant ways. His competitive philosophy, built around the specific values of skill development, preparation, and the elevation of team success through individual excellence, rather than through the kind of physical intimidation approach that has been the specific subject of the Griner governance controversy, makes his statement about Griner's conduct not simply a commercial voice entering a governance controversy, but a competitive philosophy statement from someone whose own competitive identity is the most direct possible contrast to the physical approach that the Clark era's accountability effort has been documenting as the primary governance failure that Wnba has failed to adequately address. And his cultural standing in basketball, the specific way Curry has become the representative figure of a certain kind of basketball excellence and a certain kind of basketball values, makes his public statement about Griner and the governance failures surrounding her conduct a cultural statement about the values of the broader basketball ecosystem in a way that only a figure with his specific cultural positioning can make. When Curry says he did not hold back and exposes Griner, the basketball world stops in the specific way that only Curry's voice in this specific governance context can make it stop, because the combination of what he represents commercially, philosophically, and culturally makes the statement something that every institutional stakeholder in both men's and women's basketball has to process at every level of their institutional relationship with the sport simultaneously. Let us start with what Curry actually said, because the specific content of his exposure of Griner is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the dramatic impact of his involvement without adequately examining the specific nature of what he said. Why the specific form of his exposure goes beyond the kind of general support for the accountability effort that the previous outside voices have provided, and what the specific evidentiary or institutional dimension of his exposure changes about the governance accountability conversation that the Cunningham DNA proof ban has produced as the most recent and the most dramatic chapter. Curry's exposure of Griner is not simply a prominent athlete expressing public criticism of another player's conduct in the context of a governance controversy. It is a specific and directed institutional statement that uses the particular standing Curry's specific position in the basketball ecosystem provides to accomplish something institutionally distinct from what every previous voice in the accountability conversation has accomplished. The specific nature of what he exposed, whether it involves first-hand knowledge he has about Griner's conduct through his own institutional connections to the broader basketball ecosystem, institutional information about the Wnba's governance decisions regarding Griner that his position gives him access to through the NBA's relationships with the Wnba, specific observations about the competitive and philosophical dimension of the conduct documentation that the Clark-era's accountability effort has produced, or some combination of all three dimensions, is the detail that determines the specific institutional contribution his statement makes to the accountability conversation, and why the WNBA's eruption in response is the institutional reaction of a governance apparatus that understands exactly what Curry's specific involvement adds to the accountability pressure it has been managing all season. But here is where the analysis needs to go beyond the content of what he said and into why he chose this specific moment in the accountability story to say it. Now let us talk about the timing of Curry's decision to expose Griner specifically, because the timing is the analytically significant detail that the mainstream coverage is treating as simply the most recent development in an ongoing story when it is actually the most important indicator of what Curry's institutional assessment via the governance situation currently is, and what he is specifically trying to accomplish by entering the conversation at this specific moment, rather than at any of the many earlier moments throughout the season, when the governance controversy surrounding Griner's conduct toward Clark provided opportunities for outside voices to intervene. Curry has been aware of the Clark-era's governance accountability story throughout this season, in the same way that every figure connected to the broader basketball institutional ecosystem has been aware of it. The LeBron "enough is enough" statement we covered in a previous video established the template for NBA player engagement with the WNBA governance accountability conversation. The Larry Bird and Michael Jordan coalition interventions we covered established the template for institutional authority figures from the broader Indiana and global basketball ecosystems, engaging with the specific governance failures the Clark era has documented. And the Cunningham DNA proof ban that we covered in the most recent previous videos represents the specific governance crisis that has created the institutional conditions the basketball world has been waiting for an additional voice of Curry's standing to respond to. The timing of Curry's exposure of Griner is the timing of someone who has assessed that the Cunningham DNA proof ban represents the specific governance threshold at which his own voice in the accountability conversation becomes institutionally necessary rather than simply supportive, and the specific institutional assessment behind that timing is the most important analytical detail about what Curry is trying to accomplish with his statement beyond the immediate impact of his exposure of Griner. He is not entering the conversation because the conversation has reached a dramatic moment. He is entering it because the specific governance decision to ban Cunningham for presenting DNA proof has created the institutional conditions in which Curry's particular combination of commercial, philosophical, and cultural standing adds something to the accountability pressure that has not been provided by any previous voice in the conversation, and that the governance apparatus most urgently needs to encounter at this specific moment in the accountability story. Now let us talk about what Curry's particular combination of commercial, philosophical, and cultural standing adds to the accountability pressure that no previous voice has provided, because this is the analytically significant layer that distinguishes his intervention from every previous outside voice in the Clark era's governance accountability story. The accountability pressure the governance apparatus has been managing throughout this season has been built through three primary institutional channels: the commercial channel, through Clark's own commercial ecosystem, and the commercial partner community, whose investments in the Clark era have made the governance failures commercially costly at a scale that professional sports governance apparatuses most urgently respond to. The competitive authority channel, through figures like LeBron, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan, whose competitive philosophy, credibility, and institutional standing in basketball's broader governance ecosystem make their accountability interventions impossible for the WNBA's governance apparatus to manage through the standard dismissive responses it applies to accountability pressure from sources with less specific competitive authority. And the player advocacy channel, through Cunningham's first-hand credibility and the Players Association's formal collective bargaining authority to challenge governance decisions that fall outside the institutional boundaries the collective bargaining agreement establishes. What none of those three channels has provided in exactly the form that the accountability pressure most urgently needs at this specific moment in the governance story is the specific combination of shooting excellence cultural identity, team-first competitive philosophy, and anti-physical intimidation competitive values that Curry's statement represents. The specific conduct the accountability effort has been documenting throughout this season, the physical targeting of Clark by Griner and others, the governance apparatus's inadequate response to that targeting, and the Cunningham ban for presenting DNA proof of the specific nature of that targeting, is conduct that is most specifically and most credibly indicted by the competitive philosophy that Curry embodies, rather than by any other institutional voice in the basketball ecosystem. When Curry says he did not hold back and exposes Griner, he is making a statement from the competitive philosophy that most directly and most specifically identifies what is wrong with the conduct being documented and why the governance apparatus's failure to adequately address it represents a fundamental betrayal of the competitive values that basketball at its highest expression is supposed to embody. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Curry's exposure of Griner and the WNBA's eruption in response is the latest and the most institutionally significant single outside intervention in the Clark era's governance accountability story. And understanding what it means for the institutional future of women's basketball requires examining both what it adds to the accumulated accountability pressure the governance apparatus has been managing, and what it changes about the governance situation that every previous accountability intervention has contributed to creating. The accumulated accountability pressure before Curry's statement included Clark's own commercial ecosystem pressure, LeBron's "enough is enough" statement, the Larry Bird and Michael Jordan coalition intervention, the Cunningham DNA proof exposure and the ban it triggered, and the formal legal proceedings the Players Association's challenge to the ban has initiated. Each of those accumulated pressure elements has contributed to the institutional conditions the governance apparatus is now operating in, and Curry's statement arrives as the most recent and the most culturally specific addition to that accumulated pressure at the specific moment when the governance apparatus is simultaneously managing the most formal and the most legally consequential governance accountability proceeding it has ever faced through the Players Association's challenge to the Cunningham ban. The specific institutional effect of Curry's statement in that accumulated pressure context is not simply additive. It is specifically complementary to the most important remaining institutional gaps in the accountability pressure that the governance apparatus has been able to maintain uncertainty about, despite everything the previous accountability interventions have established. And the complementary nature of his specific institutional contribution is what makes the Wnba's eruption at his statement the most institutionally comprehensive response to a single accountability intervention that the Clark era has produced. Remember that genuinely transformative institutional significance element I mentioned at the start? Here it is. The genuinely transformative institutional significance of what Curry exposed is not in the dramatic element the mainstream coverage is focusing on, but in what follows from that element as the necessary institutional implication. Curry's specific exposure of Griner establishes a competitive philosophy standard for women's basketball conduct that, once stated by a figure of his competitive philosophy credibility in the specific institutional context of the Clark era's governance accountability story, becomes the public benchmark against which every future governance decision about physical conduct in the Wnba will be measured by every institutional stakeholder in the basketball ecosystem whose own commercial and competitive relationships include investment in the values Curry represents. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about Curry's exposure and the WNBA's eruption, and why they matter beyond the immediate impact of a prominent NBA figure entering the governance accountability conversation. The specific commercial ecosystem that Curry occupies in basketball creates institutional connections between his statement and the Wnba's commercial relationships that the standard outside voice accountability intervention does not create through the same institutional mechanism. Curry's commercial relationships include partnerships with brands whose own investments in women's basketball have been part of the Clark era's commercial transformation, and his public statement about Griner and the governance failures surrounding her conduct creates a commercial alignment question for those brands that goes beyond the general advocacy alignment the statement creates for institutions connected to the broader basketball ecosystem. The specific brands that have investments in both Curry's commercial ecosystem and the WNBA's commercial development are now processing his statement against their own commercial interests in both commercial domains. And the commercial alignment pressure that processing creates for the Wnba's governance apparatus is the commercial dimension of the eruption that the mainstream coverage is not adequately examining. The second hidden angle is the specific cultural moment Curry's statement creates for the broader conversation about the relationship between competitive philosophy and governance accountability in professional basketball, that his specific cultural standing in the sport makes possible in a way that no other active player's statement could create at the same cultural scale. Curry's exposure of Griner is not simply a basketball player's statement about another basketball player's conduct. It is a cultural statement from the figure whose competitive philosophy has most specifically and most publicly shaped the culture of basketball excellence in the current era about the specific form of conduct that is most directly contrary to the values that his competitive philosophy embodies. And the cultural weight of that statement in the governance accountability conversation is the dimension of his exposure that has the most lasting institutional implications beyond the immediate eruption it has produced. My verdict on Curry's exposure and the Wnba's eruption is this, stated as directly as I can state it. Steph Curry not holding back and exposing Brittney Griner in the specific institutional context of the Clark era's most consequential governance crisis is the most culturally significant and the most competitively philosophy-grounded single outside intervention in the women's basketball governance accountability conversation that any figure in the broader basketball ecosystem has produced. And the WNBA's eruption in response is the appropriate institutional reaction to encountering the specific combination of commercial significance, competitive philosophy authority, and cultural standing that makes Curry's statement institutionally transformative in a way that every previous outside voice in the accountability conversation, however institutionally significant in their own right, was not able to be in exactly the specific form that the governance situation most urgently needed. The first reason this verdict is correct is the competitive philosophy dimension. Curry's specific competitive identity as the most celebrated practitioner of the shooting excellence and anti-physical intimidation basketball philosophy that the Clark era's accountability effort has been advocating for makes his statement about Griner's conduct not just commercially significant, but philosophically definitive, in a way that establishes a public, competitive values standard for the governance conversation that no previous outside voice could establish with the same specific philosophical authority. The second reason is the commercial ecosystem connection. Curry's commercial ecosystem creates institutional connections between his statement and the WNBA's commercial relationships that amplify the accountability pressure his statement creates beyond the individual commercial significance of any single voice entering the governance conversation. The third reason is the cultural moment his statement creates. The specific cultural weight of Curry's exposure of Griner in the governance accountability context the Clark era has produced creates a cultural benchmark for the values discussion that the governance situation requires, in a way that has permanent implications for how every future governance decision about physical conduct in the Wnba is culturally evaluated. The strongest counter-argument is that Curry's statement, however significant in its institutional weight, is another outside voice intervention, rather than a formal institutional action, of the kind that the Players Association's legal challenge represents, and that the governance accountability story will ultimately be decided through the formal institutional processes that his statement influences but does not itself constitute. That argument has genuine merit as a formal process boundary observation. The counter to the counter is that the cultural and commercial pressure that Curry's statement creates is precisely the kind of institutional pressure that professional sports governance processes respond to most directly, because it operates through the commercial relationship infrastructure that the governance apparatus depends on for its institutional sustainability. And the specific form of that pressure, in Curry's case, is more directly connected to the governance apparatus's commercial relationship dependencies than any previous outside voice has been able to create through their own statement's commercial ecosystem. So tell me in the comments right now, does Steph Curry exposing Griner and not holding back change how you think the Wnba's governance apparatus will respond to the accumulated accountability pressure the Clark era has built? Or do you think the governance apparatus has sufficient institutional inertia to continue managing even this specific combination of commercial, philosophical, and cultural accountability pressure without producing the fundamental institutional changes the entire accountability story has been demanding? Drop your answer, because this is the institutional accountability question that every development this season has been building toward.